April 27, 1942. Britain is starving its way through the worst phase of the Battle of the Atlantic. In just the past 30 days, German U-boats have sunk 273,000 tons of cargo, enough food and fuel to keep the island nation alive for weeks. Yet on this night in the Firth of Clyde, something impossible unfolds beneath the patrol boats edging through the dark. A German Type 7 submarine is caught and rising helplessly, snared by a barrier the Admiralty had dismissed as a peacetime fantasy. Patrol crews stare in disbelief as the most feared weapon of the Kriegsmarine thrashes only yards from Scottish shore. Trapped by a mesh system they were told would never work. And before dawn breaks, officers will discover this isn't even the first U-boat it has taken. As the winch crew eases off, the tension does not vanish. It climbs. Somewhere under the patrol boat, something large is fighting to get free. On the surface, nothing shows except turbulence, where the floats dip and jerk in unison. Then, caught in the harsh cone of the searchlight, a gray bow forces its way out of the water at an awkward angle, shedding streams of foam. Along its flanks, Fletcher sees not the clean lines of a friendly vessel, but the blunt, familiar profile of a German Type 7 U-boat, still blowing ballast in a frantic attempt to surface. It is not surfacing under its own terms. The forward diving planes and the base of the conning tower are wrapped in a cocoon of fine steel mesh that clings and tightens as the boat rises. The propeller astern is choked with wire, locked motionless. The submarine hangs half caught at the surface, like an animal in a snare, trapped not by mines or depth charges, but by a barrier that official studies had once dismissed as no stronger than fishing gear. Within the hour, more than 50 submariners will stand on that tilted deck with their hands raised, taken prisoner without a single shell fired in anger. And on the Clyde patrol line, officers will begin to realize that this is not the first U-boat to be caught in David Fletcher's ridiculous net, and that the quiet success unfolding in the glare is about to challenge everything the Royal Navy believes about how a harbor should be defended. By the spring of 1942, the trap on the Clyde is only a small countercurrent against a tide that has been running against Britain for nearly 3 years. Since September 1939, Admiral Karl Dönitz has built his U-boat arm into a weapon designed to strangle an island nation. Torpedoes do not just sink ships. They erase calories, fuel, and ammunition from Britain's future. Each freighter lost in the North Atlantic means less bread on civilian tables, fewer shells at the front, fewer deliveries of aviation fuel for fighter command. The numbers accumulate with grim regularity. In some months, shipping losses approach 250,000 tons. Planners in London, reading weekly summaries from the Trade Division, begin to sketch lines on charts that do not depict convoys or patrol zones, but the point at which imports fall below the minimum needed to keep the civilian population alive. In private memoranda, some estimate that if current loss rates continue, Britain may only have months before shortages and political pressure force consideration of a negotiated peace. Meanwhile, the U-boat threat is shifting closer to home. Early in the war, the most dangerous waters lie in the mid-Atlantic Gap, beyond the reach of land-based air cover. By 1941 and early 1942, German commanders have learned that the approaches to Britain's own harbors, Liverpool, Glasgow, the Clyde estuary, the Mersey and Bristol Channel, offer rich hunting grounds. Escorts, exhausted after days of high-alert steaming, tend to relax as landfall nears. Merchant captains who have survived the mid-ocean gauntlet ease their zigzag patterns and allow convoys to bunch up as they form into harbor approach lanes. U-boat captains exploit this complacency. Torpedoes find tankers and freighters within sight of headlands and harbor lights. Some ships are hit within 10 miles of their destination, their burning cargoes turning narrow channels into temporary lakes of fire. It is one thing to lose a freighter somewhere in the gray vastness between Newfoundland and Ireland. It is quite another to see one die in a confined estuary, where coastal communities watch the flames on the horizon and understand how close the war has come. The Royal Navy's main fixed defense against such incursions is a weapon inherited from the last war. Massive anti-submarine nets built from thick steel wire rope, slung from heavy floats and anchored in place like underwater fences. On paper, they appear formidable. They can, in theory, block a channel from surface to depth and absorb the impact of a ramming submarine. In practice, they are slow to in place, ruinously expensive in wire and labor, vulnerable to storms and corrosion, and increasingly suspected of being less than impregnable. With more than 50 major ports and naval bases to protect, the Admiralty continues to order these familiar structures because it lacks a clear alternative. On the Clyde, one mid-ranking officer has already decided that lack of precedent is no reason to keep doing what plainly is not working. In 1942, the Clyde is not the sort of posting that promises distinction or rapid advancement. It is a logistical artery, a staging point for convoys, an anchorage for warships, and, to many officers, a place where routine maintenance overshadows anything resembling strategy. Yet this is precisely where David Fletcher, at 38, finds himself. An officer with merchant marine experience, a background in naval architecture, and a reputation for quiet, methodical thinking, rather than dramatic intervention. His days follow a rhythm shaped by tides, reports, and the broad sheets of harbor charts spread across his desk. Weather logs arrive with predictable notes on storms that twist heavy anti-submarine nets into distortion. Diving crews report frayed cables and snapped links where steel has fatigued under relentless strain. Maintenance requests pile up alongside requisitions for new rope, timber floats, and repair teams. The cumulative effect is unmistakable. The standard defensive nets, inherited from the First World War and duplicated on peacetime assumptions, fail far more often than anyone in Whitehall seems willing to admit. As Fletcher reads through incident after incident, a more troubling pattern emerges. In several cases, divers describe mesh twisted open not by storms, but by force applied in a single direction, as if something had cut through or pushed aside the strands instead of tearing them uniformly. Intelligence summaries hint at German bow-mounted cutters, tools designed during the previous war to shear through cable barriers up to 3/4 of an inch thick. Fletcher studies diagrams and wonders why a system designed to resist blunt impact should be expected to stand against tools built specifically to defeat it. Late evenings find him sketching calculations on tea-stained message pads, mapping the energy carried by a submerged vessel at 6 knots and the torque exerted on moorings when a rigid barrier resists that momentum. The numbers point to an uncomfortable truth. Increasing the strength of a static net only increases the force transmitted back through the structure, raising the likelihood of catastrophic failure. Strength in this context may be more hindrance than help. What if, Fletcher asks himself, the barrier did not attempt to resist outright? What if it yielded slightly, deliberately, under pressure, absorbing some of the submarine's energy while allowing the mesh to slide along the hull? What if the enemy, instead of smashing through, became entangled in a web of fine wire that wrapped itself around moving parts rather than presenting a single line of resistance to be cut? He drafts a memorandum outlining the idea and circulates it quietly among a few technical officers. The response is cool, even dismissive. Some call it impractical. Others argue that lighter wire will simply break. A few regard the proposal as a misunderstanding of basic naval engineering principles. Yet Fletcher cannot ignore the arithmetic staring back at him from his sketches. If rigid systems fail because they attempt to defy physics, perhaps a flexible one could succeed by exploiting it. Armed with a small discretionary budget and surrounded by idle trawler yards, whose workers understand nets better than most naval architects, Fletcher begins to contemplate whether an untested idea deserves a real-world trial, permission or not. If you're enjoying this documentary, please like the video and share it with fellow World War II enthusiasts. Hit subscribe as well. Your support really matters and keeps this channel moving forward. By early 1942, Glasgow's trawler yards are shadows of their pre-war bustle. With fishing fleets curtailed and coastal waters dangerous, many companies have little work beyond government contracts. And even those are sporadic. Sheds smell of damp timber and machine oil, and men with decades of experience splicing nets and mending gear linger near idle benches. When Fletcher arrives with specifications for a new kind of barrier, their skepticism gives way to curiosity. They have never seen a pattern like the one he proposes. Instead of the heavy 12-foot mesh standard in Royal Navy installations, he asked for fine 6-foot squares woven from 3/8-inch wire rope. Instead of rigid timber floats, he specifies drum-shaped steel barrels that can shift slightly under tension without rolling or capsizing. Instead of massive anchors that lock the system in place, he brings diagrams of rendering winches equipped with hydraulic governors, devices that can release cable under controlled load, yielding but never collapsing. The men study the drawings, test the wire's flexibility, and begin cutting lengths across the floor. The work proceeds faster than expected. Without the enormous weight of traditional netting, the sections can be assembled in manageable spans and coiled onto barges. Fletcher, moving between workshops, finds that the fishermen-turned-fabricators understand instinctively how mesh behaves in water. They point out adjustments, tighten junctions, and reinforce key stresses without prompting. By late March, more than 2,000 feet of experimental netting lies ready. Under the guise of local modifications to harbor defenses, Fletcher arranges for the entire structure to be installed across a narrow throat of the Firth of Clyde. The operation takes days, not the months typically required for standard installations. Drum floats are positioned in stepped arrays, moorings are adjusted, hydraulic governors are calibrated to yield at a calculated load derived from the momentum of a submerged U-boat traveling at 6 knots. When the final connections are secured, the line stretches across the dark water like an unremarkable fence. Lighter, subtler, and nearly invisible from the surface. Only the crews who laid it understand what differentiates it from the massive walls of steel elsewhere along Britain's coast. For several weeks, nothing happens. Convoys pass overhead by night and day, dropping anchor in sheltered basins or steaming upriver toward Glasgow's docks. Patrol craft circle the approaches. On charts and official logs, the new installation is simply one more entry in a long list of harbor defenses. Yet beneath the surface, held taut against currents and tides, Fletcher's experimental barrier waits, an untested idea suspended between theory and reality, needing only the wrong submarine at the wrong moment to reveal whether it is ingenious or absurd. In the final week of April 1942, the remnants of Convoy 92 creep toward the British Isles after a bruising passage across the North Atlantic. Several freighters lie on the ocean floor, sunk by coordinated wolfpack attacks. Others limp forward under jury-rigged repairs. Escort crews, running on little more than discipline and habit, nurse their ships along the final stretch toward the Clyde, hoping the worst is behind them. But the U-boats that scattered the convoy days earlier are still out there. Among them is U-438, a Type 7 submarine whose commander has earned a reputation for boldness and precision in coastal penetrations. He knows the charts. German intelligence, updated through aerial reconnaissance and reports from returning captains, has mapped the fixed British net systems with unsettling accuracy. The Clyde's heavy nets appear predictable. Their depth, their moorings, their gaps for traffic, all plotted in ink. For a commander who has used these patterns twice before, the approach seems straightforward. Surface at night under a fog layer, advance at moderate speed, and when the first challenge or hydrophone trace appears, execute a crash dive shallow enough to slide beneath the expected barrier. From there, the submarine can wait, observe, and exploit the congestion as merchant ships cluster in approach lanes. On the night of April 25th, fog settles thick across the Firth. The diesel engines of U-438 thrum softly as the boat runs at 8 knots, conning tower barely visible above the swell. At 22:40, lookouts on a British patrol craft hear the heavy note of diesels where none should be. A challenge is broadcast. A minute later, U-438 begins her dive. Sharp, deliberate, bow angled downward. The commander intends to pass beneath what he believes is the lowest span of the heavy net system at approximately 80 feet. He never gets close. At roughly 55 feet, the submarine's bow encounters something unexpected. Instead of crashing into an immovable barrier, the impact feels muted, almost soft, as if the net is giving way. On moored floats above, hydraulic winches begin to feed out cable in controlled increments. The net yields in measured arcs, sliding along the hull rather than resisting outright. For a brief moment, the submarine continues forward, engines driving, ballast tanks adjusting. Then the mesh catches. Fine strands of 3/8-inch wire snag the forward diving planes. As the boat presses on, the mesh wraps around their mounting brackets, locking them at a downward angle. Automatic systems compensate by blowing ballast, trying to arrest the descent, but the trapped planes fight the correction. The submarine lurches deeper. Aft, the propeller bites into the mesh. Wire rope coils around the spinning shaft until the blades grind to a halt, with a violent shudder that reverberates through the hull. On a patrol trawler nearby, hydrophone operators hear the sequence unfold. The faint thud of first contact, the drag of metal, engines straining, then sudden mechanical silence. Orders are relayed. Searchlights sweep the fog. Minutes later, the crippled submarine breaks the surface at an awkward angle, held fast by the fine mesh wrapped around its hull. With propulsion gone and dive planes jammed, the crew has no choice but to blow ballast and surrender. In less than an hour, U-438 sits helpless in the glare, living proof that Fletcher's unorthodox idea does not merely work in theory. It works exactly as the physics suggested. News of U-438's capture travels quickly, first through whispered incredulity among patrol crews on the Clyde, then through formal signals transmitted to Portsmouth. Officers accustomed to receiving grim reports of merchant sinkings read and reread the message. A German submarine taken intact by a defensive net, its crew captured without a single depth charge dropped. The report itself is remarkable, but the reaction turns to something closer to alarm when a second message arrives 48 hours later, and then a third shortly after. On the morning of April 27th, U-454, approaching the Clyde under cover of darkness, follows nearly the same sequence as U-438. Using outdated intelligence that marks only the old heavy net lines, the commander attempts the familiar maneuver. Surface approach, then a shallow crash dive to slip beneath predicted net depths. Once again, the submarine finds Fletcher's flexible barrier waiting where no chart indicates it should be. The fine mesh, invisible in the murk, wraps itself around the dive planes and propeller shaft in almost identical fashion. Within minutes, the U-boat is immobilized in 60 feet of water. Forced to the surface under pressure from patrol craft already alerted by hydrophone traces, its commander surrenders with no chance to fight. And then, in early May, U-569 meets the same fate. 3 boats in 8 days. 3 crews captured. 3 commanders caught by an unseen line that official doctrine had once dismissed as unworkable. The Admiralty cannot ignore the pattern. Technical officers are sent north to inspect the captured vessels and the Clyde installation itself. Many arrive expecting coincidence or luck. Instead, they find physical evidence that challenges decades of assumptions. The fine mesh, once thought too light for submarine defense, has proven almost impossible for German bow cutters to sever, because those cutters are calibrated for heavier cables. The smaller mesh spacing ensures that multiple strands contact the hull simultaneously, creating redundant points of entanglement. Most surprising of all is the performance of the yielding moorings. By releasing cable under controlled tension, they prevent the submarine from generating the resistance needed to force a breakthrough. Every attempt to drive forward only draws more mesh around the boat's most critical moving parts. Cost analyses add another shock. Fletcher's barrier, installed in less than a month, costs a fraction of the heavy net systems that take half a year to emplace. Maintenance demands are minimal. Efficiency, effectiveness, economy. Everything aligns in a way naval planners cannot dismiss. Within days, orders circulate quietly though decisively. Flexible net systems modeled on the EOR Clyde installation are to be authorized for rapid deployment at key ports across Britain. The weapon that captured 3 U-boats in a week is no longer an experiment. It is a new doctrine in the making. By the summer of 1942, the transformation along Britain's coast is subtle, almost invisible from the surface. The old heavy nets still hang in their familiar positions, massive, cable-thick, well-charted obstacles that German intelligence has mapped to the inch. But now layered in front of them or stretched discreetly across narrow approaches, lie sections of fine mesh, flexible barriers modeled on the Clyde installation. They appear unremarkable in logs, usually described only as supplementary defenses. In practice, they begin to reshape the rhythm of the Battle of the Atlantic. Convoy after convoy reports uneventful entries into harbor, an anomaly in a year that had begun with near disaster. Statistical summaries reaching the Admiralty show a startling shift. Merchant ships sunk within 10 miles of major ports plunged from dozens in early 1942 to only a handful in the months that follow. Analysts, trained to distrust coincidence, search for other explanations. Escort patterns have not changed dramatically. Air coverage near the coast remains limited. Weather fluctuations do not account for the decline. One variable does: unauthorized, then quietly sanctioned, lines of flexible netting that catch what old systems could not. Meanwhile, Royal Navy planners begin adapting the concept beyond fixed positions. Fleet auxiliaries are instructed to carry portable sections, lighter than anything previously used, that can be deployed at forward anchorages in newly secured ports. Capital ships at rest increasingly find themselves surrounded by temporary fine mesh screens, quickly lowered into place and retrieved when necessary. The effect is cumulative. A doctrine that had relied for decades on brute strength begins to shift toward an approach that uses geometry, momentum, and controlled yielding to defeat intruders. Across the North Atlantic, German naval intelligence notices the change in harsher ways. Reports filter back from commanders who expected predictable harbor defenses and instead found entangling mesh where none should exist. Some return with stories of near misses, propellers briefly fouled, dive planes scraped by unexpected obstacles. Others do not return at all. Bulletins circulate within the U-boat arm warning captains that certain British ports may now be protected by subtle flexible barriers that cannot be detected by periscope observation or predicted from standard charts. These warnings are vague and incomplete, but their psychological impact is undeniable. Where coastal waters once promised easy targets, commanders begin treating them as perilous. Penetration attempts decrease. Boats loiter farther offshore, reducing their chances of intercepting tightly scheduled convoys. The near-invisible lines hanging beneath Britain's harbor approaches become a quiet deterrent, never advertised, rarely acknowledged, but increasingly decisive. The Clyde becomes a case study within naval circles, though its details remain classified. Officers who once dismissed Fletcher's idea as simplistic now cite it in internal memoranda on harbor defense. Economists calculate that the flexible barrier systems, installed in weeks and maintained with minimal effort, save more than wire and time. They save ships, fuel, cargo, and lives in a campaign where every convoy survives by the narrowest margins. In war, change usually arrives with noise, explosions, breakthroughs, sweeping orders. Here it arrives with the faint give of cable under tension and the soft hiss of hydraulic governors, yielding by design. And as more ports adopt the system, a realization spreads through the Admiralty. The doors of the island are finally beginning to close. In the official histories written after the war, David Fletcher's name rarely appears beside the dramatic accounts of wolfpack battles or carrier duels. Yet in archive reports and technical evaluations, his influence is unmistakable. The 3 submarines captured on the Clyde, U-438, U-454, and U-569, were not only trophies. They became floating laboratories, examined inch by naval engineers and intelligence officers. Their damaged dive planes and seized propeller shafts demonstrated exactly how flexible barriers behaved under real combat conditions, validating calculations Fletcher had once sketched in pencil on the corner of a maintenance form. The intelligence value of the captured boats went further. One was recommissioned under British colors and used to study German operating procedures, hydrodynamic performance, and acoustic signatures. Another yielded codebooks and equipment that quietly aided cryptologic efforts already underway at Bletchley Park. But beyond these tangible gains, a broader strategic shift had begun. A willingness to replace rigid, expensive structures with systems that used physics and the enemy's own movement to neutralize threats. As the war progressed, Fletcher was promoted and eventually assigned to naval research on harbor defenses. He advised on improved meshes, revised mooring geometries, and more efficient yielding mechanisms. In the decades that followed, his underlying principle, controlled flexibility, found expression in post-war harbor nets, mine countermeasure systems, and even early experiments in synthetic fiber protection barriers. Though materials change, steel wire giving way to Kevlar and alloyed composites, the logic remained constant. A barrier does not need to be stronger than the attacker if it can entangle, disrupt, or redirect that attacker's momentum. Long after the last U-boat surrendered, the Clyde remained a place where the lesson of 1942 lingered in memory. Harbors that once seemed exposed became symbols of quiet resilience. Retired sailors, who had served on patrol, recalled the night when a German submarine rose helplessly into the glare, wrapped in a mesh many believed could never work. Engineers cited the case when demonstrating the advantage of yielding systems to younger officers. And in classified briefings well into the Cold War, the Clyde captures were referenced as an example of innovation, born not from committees or directives, but from a single officer who trusted his training, his calculations, and the evidence of his own eyes. On calm evenings, the surface of the Firth settles into a dark mirror, betraying nothing of the lines that once hung beneath. But the image remains, a slender barrier stretching quietly across a channel, unseen by the enemy, and ignored by many of the defenders, yet capable of changing the fate of ships, convoys, and perhaps even nations. It is a reminder that not all victories echo with cannon fire. Some emerge from a shift in thinking, a willingness to see weakness in what once was called strength, and strength in what others dismissed as ridiculous. If you've made it this far, you're one of us, searching for the truth behind the headlines and the courage behind the silence. Subscribe to the channel, and let's keep exploring the hidden wars, secret operations, and untold fates that shape the world we live in.